Good morning. I'm Bill Potter. I'm the University Librarian here at the University of Georgia, and I'd like to welcome you to the 7th Annual Georgia Writer Hall of Fame induction ceremony, where today we will honor Bailey White, a Thomasville native, and Calder Willingham from Rome, whom we honor posthumously. The Georgia Writers Hall of Fame was created by the University of Georgia Libraries in 2000 to honor Georgia's writers. The Hall of Fame is administered by the Hargett Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which is home to the Georgiana Collection, the most extensive collection of materials written by Georgians and about Georgia. The annual exhibit, which honors the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, is currently on display in the Hargett Library on the 3rd floor of the main library, and I would encourage you all to take a look at it. In the first year of the Hall of Fame, we inducted 12 authors, and since that time, 17 additional authors have been added. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize Mary Ellen Brooks, the head of the Hargett Rare Book and Manuscript Library, as well as Skip Hewlett, the head of the Georgiana Collection, for starting this program and for seeing it through. As well as Mary Ellen and Skip, I'd like to thank Chantel Dunham, Leandra Nessel, Debbie Dove, and Mackenzie Herring from the library's development office for the work they've done in coordinating this event today. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize our Georgia Writers Hall of Fame Board of Judges who are in attendance today. First, should I embarrass you, make you stand up? Why not? First is Mrs. Mary Adams, the First Lady of the University. Mary, right there. Mary Ellen Brooks, the head of the Hargett Library, who's way in the back. Dr. Stephen Corey, editor of the Georgia Review, who's right over here. Peggy Gallus, a great friend of the university and of the library. Julie Hunt, a past member of the Board of Regents. I don't think I've seen Julie today, nope. Dr. Hugh Ruppersberg, Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences and Professor of English. And then I'm looking for Nancy. Nancy Grayson from the University of Georgia Press. As well as these appointed members, past inductees serve a term on the Board of Judges, and we're honored today to be joined by 3 members of the board of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame: Terry Kay, right here, Dr. Farrell Sams, and Dr. John Stone. So to kick this off and to present the award to the family of Calder Willingham, I'd like to introduce Dr. Frank Miner, English professor at Georgia Highlands College in Rome, Georgia. Dr. Miner has written and lectured on Willingham's screenwriting career at the annual Rome Film Festival. Dr. Miner?
First of all, a little bit about how I got here. When I was in graduate school at the University of Mississippi, I decided to write my thesis on a book called Thieves Like Us by Edward Anderson. And I watched the 2 film versions of it. The second one was filmed in the 70s, directed by Robert Altman. And I noticed that the screenplay credits were, of course, by Calder Willingham. Not long after that, I caught on The Late Show a movie called The Strange One. I guess as many of you have seen it. The film version of Calder Willingham's novel, End as a Man. And again, I saw the same credit. A year after that, I moved to Birmingham. About that time, the movie Ramblin' Rose came out. Went to it, loved it, again, saw that name. The next year, I moved to Rome, Georgia, and within a few months, I found out, oh, I'm living in Calder Willingham's hometown. Not long after that, I found in a used bookstore a copy of End as a Man. Then I read some of the other books and became interested in him. So what I have today really is just sort of a brief overview of Willingham's career, and I will be focusing on his connection to Rome, which is where I currently live. And I want to begin with what I think is a great quote from the novel Eternal Fire. I'll be talking quite a bit about Eternal Fire today. He had forgotten in New York what masters of social intercourse Southerners really were. He felt a renewed respect for the gifts of his people. Conversation was still a fine art in the Old South, and here was a fragment of the South on the veranda. There were, to be sure, a few people with the touch of the poet in Yankeedom, but the ruck and muck of the North were inarticulate barbarians who could not even give a coherent account of going to the post office. By what route did such mute souls dare patronize the South? Randy had to smile at his own jingo reflections, aware as he was of certain contradictions in his homeland. As he himself had often said, the South was a tragic land, ridden with problems of caste and class far beyond anything in the North. This was the burden that bore Sweet Dixie into the dust. Through the thoughts of the character Randolph Sutherland Shepherdson III in his Southern Gothic epic, Eternal Fire, writer in exile Calder Willingham voices his ambivalent feelings about his hometown of Rome, Georgia. Echoing Quentin Compton's, "I don't hate the South, I don't hate the South," Randolph Shepherdson is a sensitive artist who is at once an accepted member of the small-town aristocracy and a detached observer and critic of it. Said Willingham, "It seemed to me that class and how much money you had was more important than anything in the Rome, Georgia I knew. Of course, that's the way it was nearly everywhere in the South, at least when I was growing up. Social lines were drawn very clearly, and I always hate that. It was probably one of the reasons why I left the South." Willingham found early notoriety when his first novel, The End is a Man, became a bestseller in the late 1940s. Reviewing the novel for the New York Times Book Review, James T. Farrell, who's a well-known novelist in his own right, he made much of Willingham's age, writing, "The book is all the more remarkable because it was written by a man of 23. I consider it a permanent contribution to American literature. Calder Willingham, a native of Georgia, has an unusually sharp and sure ear for speech." The young artist had clearly arrived, but sophomore efforts, a string of books in the 1950s, failed to measure up. Willingham said in 1953 that success is always dangerous and early success is deadly. What I went through writing my second book shouldn't happen to a dog. A 1989 profile in the Rome News-Tribune finds Willingham looking back on his career. He claims that he could have been as famous as his peers Norman Mailer and Truman Capote, but did not because he shunned self-promotion. And if you know anything about Mailer and Capote, they certainly did not. Critics could never decide on his talents. Atlantic, and these were reviews, the first two were from reviews of End is a Man. Atlantic said that he had a mind for the hallucinating and the psychopathic, and Time said End is a Man read like the notes of a small-town peeper on the broom closet of hell. But Jack Kroll of Newsweek called him perhaps the outstanding talent of that generation of post-World War II authors. And the New Yorker said that he inadvertently fathered black comedy. As Willingham himself summed up his literary reputation, "I bother critics. They can't seem to fit me into a neat little category." Although few moviegoers have noticed his name in the credits, Willingham's film work is an important legacy to our culture. Willingham's opinion of the movie business changed greatly over the years. Some of his earlier comments about his film work echo those of William Faulkner, who viewed screenwriting as a prostitution of his talents, a way of supporting his family when the book-buying public had forgotten him. In 1963, Willingham said, "I go to Hollywood purely for the money. I do an honest job, but I write to order. It's like being a tailor." Later, he decided he could reach a much larger audience through films than through books. Serious literature, he said in 1989, may have become peripheral in our society. Today's carrier of truth, if there is such a thing, may be in the visual arts, movies and TV. Willingham wrote or co-wrote the screenplays for several films that are now considered classics, including Paths of Glory, The Graduate, for which he received an Oscar nomination for Best Screenplay Adaptation and won the British Academy Award for it, and Little Big Man. Even the lesser-known One-Eyed Jacks and Thieves Like Us have cult followings among film buffs. Although, as Joseph Millichap writes, these films share the common themes of a young man's quest for maturity and manhood, Willingham's personal mark on these films is obscured by that of their famous directors. Willingham worked with the darlings of the auteur crowd, Stanley Kubrick, Mike Nichols, Arthur Penn, Robert Altman, and David Lean. He worked for a while on the bridge on the River Kwai. Willingham's last screen credit was a much less anonymous one. Ramblin' Rose, directed by Martha Coolidge, was based on his highly autobiographical novel. Ramblin' Rose is, among other things, a coming-of-age story about a young boy whose family runs a hotel in a small Georgia town. But he falls in love with a young woman from the Rome tracks who's been hired as a maid by his family. Ramblin' Rose lacks the bitter tone of Willingham's earlier works, but does manage to include several of Willingham's major concerns: class, family, sex. Perhaps because the novel and screenplay were written later in life, the vision of his hometown, which is called Glenville instead of Rome, as it is in Eternal Fire, that is a warm, nostalgic one, very different from the caustic fire. Putting together a full portrait of Willingham is a difficult task. Bits and pieces of him can be found in a variety of sources. The recollections of acquaintances and relatives who remember a quiet, polite boy who liked to play billiards and tennis. His letters, many of which are included at the UGA library, which reveal an artist frustrated with critics who misunderstood both his work and his native land. The fiction, difficult to classify or to group with other literature from the South. And his screenplays, most of them adaptations of stories by other writers. Different personae emerge here. The local boy made good, the iconoclastic writer of scandalous books, the scrappy Southerner waging war with the Northern critics, the successful screenwriter who added a room to his house every time he completed a screenplay. As we trace his life, we see a boyhood spent largely in Rome, Georgia, a short stint at the Citadel, 2 years matriculation at the University of Virginia, the life of a young man in Greenwich Village, settling down with a family in Northampton, New Hampshire, a place Willingham described as dry, beautifully cold, and quiet. Like many artists, perhaps like many people, Willingham was a man of contradictions. Calder Bayard Willingham Jr. was born in Atlanta in 1922. His parents, Calder Bayard Willingham Sr. and Eleanor Churchill Willingham, were native Romans, and the family moved to Rome when Calder Jr. was 2. At the time of their move to Rome, Mrs. Willingham had inherited downtown Rome's Third Avenue Hotel, which Mr. Willingham managed. Such an environment proved to be a fertile ground for young Calder's imagination. At the hotel, young Calder would have been privy to overheard gossip and the ribald talk of the salesmen who stayed there. 2 of his novels, Geraldine Bradshaw and Reach to the Stars, take place in hotels. And several crucial scenes in Eternal Fire also take place at a hotel, very much like the one where young Willingham hung out. And the primary setting of the autobiographical Ramblin' Rose is the hotel where former prostitute Rose finds honest work. Willingham's contemporaries and relatives in Rome remember a quiet, polite boy. Clara Willingham, who married Calder's first cousin, Tom Willingham, remembers that when she met him, Calder was a shy sort of boy. He wasn't very outgoing. He was interested in writing. He became more charming as he matured. As a child, Calder's primary interests seemed to have been athletic ones. If you look at the Darlington School yearbooks from 1939 and 1940, the only activity listed under Calder's name is tennis. Interestingly, there's no mention of Willingham's involvement with the literary club, the yearbook, or the newspaper. However, Clara Willingham recalls that the English teacher, Sadie Langston, was very influential. She told Calder, "You can write." And when asked if Calder's parents encouraged him to write, Mrs. Willingham replied, they didn't have to. Calder's parents encouraged their children to be individuals, not to worry about conformity. Eleanor Willingham, who earned a master's degree in history from Columbia University, taught history at Shorter College in Rome. Mary Will Carmichael, who attended Shorter in the 1930s, remembers her as an excellent teacher. Calder Sr. was known for his unpredictable sense of humor. Another great anecdote from Clara Willingham, she told me that we had a house on Sherwood Avenue. I remember Calder Sr. was outside. There he was writing in my front yard. I said, "Calder, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm counting your windows." I said, "Why?" He said, "Didn't you know there's a window tax?" I think he was pulling my leg. He was laughing. And like the family in Ramblin' Rose, the Willinghams were prone to what they called epizootics. That's a word that's used quite a bit in that book, or temporary flights of insanity. The nicknames given to the Willinghams can be found in the book. Eleanor was called Sugar. Sister Frances was called Doll Baby. Brother Warren was Wawa. One major difference is that Calder, known as Red in his youth, is called Buddy in Ramblin' Rose. And another anecdote, Calder Willingham was directly involved in the making of the film version of Ramblin' Rose and personally recruited Robert Duvall to play the part of the father. He was giving him advice on how to play the part. He told Duvall, "You haven't got my father right yet." Duvall replied, "I haven't got a shovel large enough to dig up your daddy yet." After a stint at the Citadel and 2 years at the University of Virginia, Willingham took on the life of a bohemian writer in Greenwich Village, but retained his ties to Rome. Clara Willingham remembers the visit she made there in the early 1950s. She said, "It was an eye-opener for us. We hadn't been to Greenwich Village all that much. He had 2 apartments there. One was for writing. It was kind of gloomy looking there. Then he had a precious apartment like an artist ought to have. It was delightful, and he was delightful." Willingham's fiction, in particular his magnum opus, Eternal Fire, has familiar Southern trappings. The grotesque of Flannery O'Connor and Carson McCullers, the decaying aristocracy of Faulkner's Compsons and Sauteruses, the poor whites of Caldwell's Tobacco Road, the usual regional preoccupations with religion, race, and class. But Willingham subverts the cliches in Fire by using a distanced, ironic tone that verges to parody at times, all the while keeping the reader's interest for over 600 pages of sprawling melodrama. His later Ramblin' Rose at first may seem like another coming-of-age story, but in many ways the novel is a love letter to Willingham's generous family. Again, he avoids the sweet potatoes and cornbread sentimentality of similar books by emphasizing the sexuality of the title character, Rose, a wayward woman taken in by the narrator's family who try to reform her. As James R. Frakes wrote in the New York Times Book Review, it's a book about the South, the Depression, eavesdropping, salty dogs, a beautiful enigma named Rose, and most emphatically about authentic family love. Willingham hoped that one day he would be rediscovered by an appreciative audience, as happened to William Faulkner in the late 40s. In several letters, Willingham speaks of how Faulkner had been written off by the literary world in the early 40s with his books out of print, but that changed when the portable Faulkner was printed in 1949 and he soon won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Willingham attributed this resurrection of reputation to the readers, with no help from the critics. The critics wrote Willingham come in after the fact and declare a writer to be good. He said that although he didn't pay much attention to reviews, he says of critics, it's one thing to dislike a book, but it's something else again to hate it with an emotional intensity. He thought that Eternal Fire would be his blockbuster and that rarity, a book that does very well both critically and commercially. When read today, the novel is fascinating on several different levels. For those familiar with Rome, it is a thinly disguised portrait of Willingham's hometown, with the place names barely changed. For example, Rome's Myrtle Hill Cemetery becomes Magnolia Hill, Martha Berry College is called Mary Baldwin College, and the rivers, the Ostanula, Etowah, become the Chickahoochee, Pagawag, and Wapatucki. It's hard to say. Willingham writes himself and his father into the story in the guise of Wilcox Hilliard Sr. and his son Buddy, who happens to be very knowing for his 14 years old, and Wilcox Hilliard runs the hotel in the novel. Eternal Fire belongs to the genre of small-town exposés, like its predecessors, Winesburg, Ohio, Kings Row, Peyton Place. Willingham's novel rips the lid off surface placidity and the conservatism of its setting and revels in the corruption and sexual intrigue that are found at its core. When asked how Rome's citizens felt about the books, C.J. White recalled they were proud, and after they read them, they were shocked, but nobody got mad. And Claire Willingham said, I was proud of him. Some may have thought the books were risque. They may have been based on things that happened, but it frequently becomes fictitious. In a 1989 interview, Willingham recalled the local storm caused by the book's publication, especially over the use of an old family name. He said, when I wrote the book, I didn't even remember that there were any Littles in Rome. Once again, he claimed the story and characters were imaginary, although local citizens were not convinced. In the same interview, he talks of how a similar confusion of fact and fiction surrounded the publication of It as a Man. Since Willingham had attended the Citadel, it was assumed that every word of it was true. He claimed here that the book was not inspired by any psychotic cadet he knew at the Citadel, but instead was his reaction to the horrors of World War II. Back to Eternal Fire. I apologize for the digression. In Eternal Fire, we find variations of several stock Southern characters. The corrupt Judge Ball, who embezzled his nephew's fortune. The manipulative Aunt Rose, who's equal parts DAR charmer and vicious dragon lady. Laurie, the poor but virtuous young school teacher. Randy, her terribly innocent, terribly gullible boyfriend. And the secondary characters are an unusual lot. The improbably named Harry Diadem, professional stud with a shady past, a crazed radio evangelist, his deranged dwarf of the sun, Whit Galladay, the tragic drunk, and Poppy, his oversexed daughter, and a half dozen or so other colorful types, plus enough storylines for 3 or 4 less ambitious novels. But somehow he manages to work them all into a cohesive whole. It's one of the most entertaining books I must say I've ever read. A comment that Willingham made about Erskine Caldwell, another Georgia writer who's often been misunderstood, I think could probably apply to his own writing. This is from a preface to a reprint of Tobacco Road. Willingham states that Caldwell was not a realistic novelist at all, but a narrative poet, a wild comic genius and a true mythmaker of the South, still reeling in shock and dislocation from a terrible war. The style is simple, unadorned, dry, and immensely supple and powerful. The narration is wholly unpredictable and at the same time unerring. Characters are boldly and quickly drawn with broad slashing brushstrokes. I think the same can be said for Willingham's own work.
Thank you for that, Dr. Miner, and I'd like to, at this time, ask Ms. Smith if you would be honoring us with the receipt of this award for outstanding writing and in recognition of an enduring contribution to the study and understanding of the state of Georgia, its history, its culture, and its people. We'd like to present this for 2007 to Calder Willingham. To Ms. Smith, his widow. Thank you.
On behalf of Calder's family, I'd like to thank the University of Georgia Library for inducting Calder into your Literary Hall of Fame. In his lifetime, Calder traveled widely and came to know many different kinds of people. But for all his cosmopolitan experiences, there still remained deep within him the adventurous boy who roller skated down City Clock Hill in Rome. And if you know Rome, you probably know City Clock Hill. Is it still there? I guess it is. Yeah. As he grew older, Calder came to see the South and his family as a source of his gift for storytelling, his wit, and his values. If Calder were here today, I know he would be pleased to share the company of the illustrious Georgia writers. And I know he'd be very grateful. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Smith. Now, Bill will introduce the presenter of the next award.
Well choreographed all that was. At this point, to induct Bailey White, I'm going to ask Dr. Farrell Sands to come forward and induct her formally into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame.
I want to do a little housekeeping. Can y'all hear me better here or back behind this thing? Can you hear me from back there? I've got hearing aids. Get behind it. Yes, ma'am. This is a signal honor for me to introduce this lady today, and that is a very well-deserved noun that I use in that sentence. I was in awe before I met her. After I met her, I felt like I had run into Peter Pan, who had Tinkerbell's Stardust. Bailey White is hard to describe, and you fall back on ancient literature. Who is Sylvia, that all the swains adore her? But she is an outstanding author. I want to congratulate the committee who elected her for this award, who nominated her for it, and who elected it. She is highly deserving. She is a writer in the truest sense of the word. When I was at Mercer University 60 years ago, we had an eccentric history professor who was a Boer War veteran, B-O-E-R, and he had a big box of matches in his study. Everybody smoked at that time, and it was a big box of what we call kitchen matches. And he had a hand-printed sign over it, "Don't take two when one will do." Bailey White writes this way. She writes sparingly, but she goes to the heart of it. She depicts characters. She establishes a place. She's a fifth-generation Southerner. Her great-grandfather was a carpetbagger who came north after the late Great Unpleasantness and bought up 5,000 acres of cheap land in Thomas County. And somewhere along the line, his progeny got converted. There is nobody any more Southern than Bailey White, and nobody who is more accomplished an author. And it's my great privilege and honor to present her to you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's such an honor to share this with Calder Willingham. And I have had the occasion to to observe the difficulty of following Feral Sam's on any stage and swore I would never be in that position, and here I am today. I just want to say that being a writer is such a private, almost secretive business until the book is published, and then you are thrust into the public eye. It's disconcerting when that point comes to be known and recognized by your readers who are really strangers. But it feels so good to come home and be included in a group like this with people that I admire so much and now feel part of. So thank you very, very much.
Well, it's one of the shorter ceremonies we've had, but I want to thank you all for coming today. There's plenty of food and treats back there. I'd encourage you all to have something to eat or drink and mingle a bit. I believe there are some shuttles that'll be running back to the parking lot fairly soon. And then the Board of Judges will be convening, we'll be convening after a lunch for the board and for the winners. So again, thank you all for coming. I greatly appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you all next year. Thank you.